Bonjour, pessimisme aujourd'hui à Rambouillet. Après 2 jours d'intenses négociations, les délégations serbes et albanaises n'ont pas réussi visiblement à s'entendre. Le délai expire cet après-midi à 15 h. Madeleine Albright, le secrétaire d'État américain, a soumis la nuit dernière aux négociateurs un ultime projet pour tenter d'imposer la paix au Kosovo. Les 6 ministres des Affaires étrangères du groupe de contact seront présents ce matin à Rambouillet pour évaluer le résultat des dernières discussions. En attendant, les forces de l'OTAN se préparent. Près de 400 appareils sont prêts à intervenir.
C'est une décision qui sera prise en accord avec tous les pays du groupe de contact. Nous ici, nous sommes juste ici pour faire notre travail et pour être prêts au cas où. Nous avons des moyens de défense aérienne avec le Mirage 2000C et des moyens d'attaque au sol de l'autre côté avec les Jaguars et les Mirage 2000D.
Toujours pas de nouvelles des 3 randonneurs bloqués dans le massif de la Vanoise. Ils ont passé leur 7e nuit blottis dans un igloo à plus de 3000 mètres d'altitude. Les sauveteurs ont beaucoup de mal à intervenir en raison du mauvais temps. Ce matin encore, Météo France prévoit de nouvelles chutes de neige sur les Alpes. De nombreuses routes sont coupées et plusieurs centaines de vacanciers ont dû être hébergés au Jet et à Morzine en Haute-Savoie. À Chamonix, 200 habitants des hameaux voisins ont été évacués hier en raison des risques d'avalanche. De l'autre côté de la frontière en Suisse, les recherches se poursuivent pour retrouver d'éventuels survivants après la coulée de neige qui a emporté plusieurs chalets près de Sion. 2 personnes ont été tuées, 8 autres sont portées disparues, parmi elles des touristes français. Enfin, dans les Pyrénées, 2 autres randonneurs sont activement recherchés. Et puis dans l'est de la France, la situation reste préoccupante. Les eaux du Rhin ne cessent de monter. Certains spécialistes parlent déjà de la crue du siècle. Un dispositif de grande ampleur a été mis en place pour tenter de limiter les dégâts. Dans le Doubs, les habitants du village de Blussangeau sont totalement isolés. Ils attendent l'intervention de l'armée qui devrait établir un pont flottant pour les approvisionner. Nous verrons à la fin de ce journal les prévisions météo. À Bruxelles, les ministres européens de l'agriculture vont poursuivre aujourd'hui leurs discussions. Au menu, la réforme de la PAC, la politique agricole commune, une réforme qui provoque la colère des agriculteurs. Ces derniers craignent une baisse sensible de leurs subventions. Hier, ils étaient plusieurs dizaines de milliers à manifester dans la capitale belge. Des incidents ont éclaté, un gendarme a été blessé, 12 autres personnes interpellées. Les agriculteurs n'excluent pas de nouvelles opérations dans la journée. Plusieurs cas de primo-infection signalés dans des crèches parisiennes. 5 enfants et un agent de la ville de Paris ont été contaminés par une auxiliaire puéricultrice atteinte de tuberculose. Un contrôle généralisé a été effectué auprès de tous les enfants qui ont été en contact avec la jeune femme. Pour finir, une information qui donne froid dans le dos. Dans la nuit du 26 septembre 83, on a évité de justesse la 3e guerre mondiale. C'est ce qu'affirme en tout cas dans le Figaro le colonel Petrov qui dirigeait cette nuit-là le centre russe de contrôle des attaques de missiles. Un satellite soviétique venait de détecter une attaque nucléaire américaine, mais il s'agissait en fait d'une simple défaillance technique. Heureusement, le colonel en question a gardé son sang-froid et n'a pas répliqué à cette alerte. On passe tout de suite aux prévisions de la météo.
La météo avec Troc de Lille.
Toujours de la neige sur les reliefs. En revanche, la situation s'améliore sur le quart nord-est du pays. À noter tout de même qu'une nouvelle perturbation arrive par l'ouest. Les températures varieront de 3 à 15 degrés. Je vous souhaite une excellente journée.
On World News Tonight this Monday in Jasper, Texas, the jury hears how a black man tried to save himself as he was dragged to his death on a country road. The deadline in Kosovo, will it be war or compromise? Our closer look at healthcare when HMOs do what they're supposed to do, and the power of a single telephone in the hands of a woman.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We're going to begin in Jasper, Texas again tonight because today in the murder trial of the white supremacist John William King, the jury heard the most devastating details of what it was like for James Byrd Jr., a black man, to be dragged to his death behind a truck. The prosecution has finished presenting its evidence today, and King's defense lasted only an hour. But for the people in the courtroom, it was a day not to be forgotten. James Byrd tried to save himself. Not that he ever had a chance. ABC's Steve Osunsami reports from Jasper.
Every juror knew how James Byrd Jr. was dragged from the back of this gray pickup truck. But today, a pathologist told them he was alive, conscious, and struggling. Dr. Tommy Brown explained how Byrd shifted his body in a desperate attempt to escape the pain for 1.5 miles. With a chain tied around his ankles, Byrd tried to pull himself forward. He twisted and turned until he was pulled over this drainage pipe, and it severed his head.
We owed this to the public, to the country, to the world, to put on everything we had, and that's what we've done.
Some of James Byrd's family chose to stay away from the courtroom this morning to avoid reliving the story of this human being's suffering. In a town where more than 1/3 of all residents are African American, his relatives say the horror of this crime is now painfully clear.
It strikes fear in your heart. No, it strikes fear into it, saying this can actually happen to you. This is something just because of the color of my skin that I can be targeted for the same kind of violence.
Prosecutors introduced more evidence of King's hate, this jail cell graffiti, King's white supremacist calling card, and the beer and the smoke prosecutors say he enjoyed after the murder. The accused killer hid his face in his hands. Even observers who followed this case from the very beginning found this day shocking.
It's sad. It's scary. It leaves you speechless almost.
Prosecutors introduced a final piece of evidence today, a letter King wrote from his jail cell to one of the other 2 defendants. In it, King writes, "Even if we are convicted, we will have made history." Steve Osunsami, ABC News, Jasper, Texas.
The other major story of the day is, of course, overseas. In France today, the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, has been trying to persuade the ethnic Albanians to accept a peace agreement for the Yugoslav province of Kosovo so that a deadline tomorrow, a threatened deadline of NATO bombing, need not be acknowledged. Neither the Serbs nor the ethnic Albanians have signed on to this agreement. The Serbs are under the threat of airstrikes if they're the only holdouts. And tonight, as ABC's John McQuethy reports, the Serbs seem to be preparing for battle.
Intelligence sources tell ABC News that the Serbs are dispersing tanks and troops to make them harder to hit, mobilizing the reserves, dispatching medical people to the field. All apparent indicators that Serb leader Milosevic will not back down and is preparing to be hit by NATO airstrikes. It is either that, sources say, or an elaborate bluff. If Milosevic does not compromise, and the ethnic Albanians do, then Pentagon sources say the first airstrikes would combine unmanned cruise missiles, more than 100 of them, with radar-evading F-117 stealth fighter bombers. The goal, blind and disrupt Serbia's air defenses, which include up-to-date Russian-made missiles and radar. Serb air defenses are considered capable, under the right circumstances, of shooting down a NATO plane, which is making planners very cautious. The next phase of an air campaign would involve the bombing of Serb troop and police units in both Kosovo and Greater Serbia.
You put a lot of hurt on him in a very short period of time, and when I say short period of time, I'm talking 2 to 3 days.
What would happen after that if the Serbs continue to resist is not clear. America's European allies seem to have little stomach for a long-term bombing campaign, which is something Milosevic may be counting on. John McQuethy, ABC News, the Pentagon.
Now, the domestic business of the country. At the White House today, the president met with the nation's governors in town for their annual winter meeting. While the Clinton administration and the Congress are talking a lot about getting back to business, now that the impeachment trial is over, the governors are thumping their chests a bit and pointing out that they've been on the job all along. ABC's Sam Donaldson is at the White House.
At the White House, the governors told the president they want to see a return to civility in Washington and want to work with him on a forward-moving agenda. But they made clear, on their terms. Consider the $206 billion settlement the states won from the tobacco companies to defray Medicaid costs for tobacco-related illnesses. The states want to keep it all.
This is state money. The federal government was invited to participate, but declined.
But under the law, the federal government maintains it must have a share, because
The majority of money in Medicaid is, but the burden is borne by the federal government. The current law requires the federal government to recoup that.
Then there's education.
Do you have to move a distance?
The president plugged hard today for his new education initiative. Federal money he wants tied to certain priorities, such as classroom size. The governors want the money, but they want to decide how to spend it.
The key words are flexibility for us, reasonable levels of funding for us, and also for us to be willing to be held accountable, and we are.
The president made no immediate response on tobacco, but hit back hard on education.
We don't have any business telling you whom to hire, how to teach, how to run schools. But let's not kid ourselves. We are not doing our children any favors by continuing to subsidize practices that don't work and failing to invest in practices that do.
The president pledged to work with the governors, even to the point of asking Congress to make an exception to the law so they can keep the tobacco money, as long as they commit to spending it on tobacco-related issues. What all this seems to show, Peter, is that while in this post-impeachment era, the dialogue once again may be civil, the struggle over control of the dollars remains as fierce as ever.
Thank you, Sam. Sam Donaldson at the White House on the subject of money. There's a major cutback at the country's largest clothing maker today. Levi Strauss is going to lay off a third of its workforce, which is almost 6,000 workers. The company will close half of its 22 plants and shift the work overseas where production is cheaper. Levi is suffering in large measure because young people are not buying Levi's jeans as their parents did. On the other hand, many companies are still adding workers. Sign of the economy, a survey of 16,000 firms published today finds that a third plan to hire additional workers in the second quarter of the year. That means that the overall job market should stay strong through the early part of the summer. The legendary Pinkerton Detective Agency is being bought by a Swedish security firm. Pinkerton detectives guarded Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, chased the outlaw Jesse James, and worked for industrialists trying to crush the labor movement in its early days. The new, now Swedish company will be the world's largest security operation. On Wall Street today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was up more than 212 points to close at 95.52. On the NASDAQ, stocks were up 58.5 points, almost. When we come back, trying to keep weapons know-how inside Russia. Question is American aid paying for the very thing it's been trying to prevent? And the power of the phone call, in fact, the most powerful tool they've ever possessed.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, brought to you by Nature's Resource Herbs.
In Washington today, the government office that investigates how the government spends its money is very concerned about a program that provides money, U.S. money, to Russia, especially given that the Clinton administration wants to expand the program. The General Accounting Office finds that it may be looking at a program that has gone wrong. Here's ABC's Bob Jamieson.
Boris Zirkin and Yuri Yashin are scientists who used to work in Russia's chemical weapons program. They are now doing research into pollution control, paid for by the United States to prevent the spread of weapons technology. They are examples of what the program is designed to accomplish. But today's GAO report found U.S. aid may be paying for the very thing it's supposed to prevent. The U.S. taxpayer may be supporting scientists still working on Russian weapons programs. And worse, American money has gone to at least 4 Russian institutes, which may have helped countries seeking nuclear technology, including Iran and Libya. And even when the money has gone where it was intended, 40% has been siphoned off to pay Russian taxes.
The real problem is that these weapons scientists are still in their weapons laboratories, and I think we need to not fund scientists who are still there. We need to get the scientists out of the weapons laboratories.
The aid program has spent hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 5 years on the scientists and to destroy everything from nuclear warheads to chemical weapons. The administration now wants to spend $4 billion more, some of that money on housing the demoralized Russian army. But should U.S. taxpayers be paying to house Russian soldiers? That's just one of many questions being asked about the American aid program. Key Republicans on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee today questioned the White House plan to expand the program. Despite the criticism, the administration still believes a bigger aid program is the best way to keep nuclear weapons and technology inside Russia. It's a multi-billion-dollar bet. Bob Jamieson, ABC News, Moscow.
The Congressional Committee overseeing the government's efforts to fix the year 2000 computer bug problem issued its quarterly report card today. Overall, the government went up from a D to a C+. The report did say that the Transportation Department, State, and Defense Departments still lag far behind in upgrading their computer programs. The National Cancer Institute says today that giving chemotherapy and radiation simultaneously can cut the risk of death from invasive cervical cancer in half. And they cite 5 different studies. This is the first breakthrough in the treatment of this particular cancer since the 1950s. In a moment, the difference when HMOs make an additional effort and the difference when they just give up. We'll take a closer look. This week we're going to take another look at the turbulent relationship between many Americans and their health care providers. 150 million Americans are now enrolled in HMOs or other managed care programs. Most polls tell us that 80% of Americans are satisfied with what they're getting. Still, the idea that health care companies cut costs at the expense of quality care is a pretty enduring one. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, let's take a closer look at the upside. Here's ABC's Michelle Norris.
Keith Welter was diagnosed with diabetes in 1983. 14 years later, he lost both his legs due to poor circulation. He says that loss could have been avoided if his doctors had kept in touch once he left the hospital.
Not once did he say, or did the nurses say, that the consequences of diabetes is such and such, is kidney damage, heart failure.
Tragedies like this happen time and again because of a fundamental flaw in health care. Patients often do not see doctors until they are in crisis.
By the time they come back in, we're doing damage control instead of damage prevention.
Americans spend close to $500 billion a year treating chronic disease. Some managed care plans are aggressively trying to cut those costs and at the same time improve health care. The remedy? Teach patients how to manage their disease and in the long run avoid costly complications.
For example, take diabetes, a chronic disease with no cure that affects 16 million Americans. It is the leading cause of blindness, amputations, and kidney failure in the U.S. Half of all HMOs now have disease management plans for diabetes. At the Health Partners HMO in Minnesota, that approach has helped reduce the number of serious complications by 16%. Health Partners discovered that it's really very simple.
And your cholesterol level.
Nurses, nutritionists, and other health specialists work one-on-one to educate patients in between doctor's visits.
Hi, Tricia, it's Joy, the dietitian from Health Partners.
And a hotline provides quick and easy counseling, or if needed, a gentle reminder.
I can give you a call once every couple weeks or once a month and just see how things are going.
By offering them this additional support, I think it really gets at the meat or the nitty-gritty of what patients need to help them get control over the disease.
Keith Welter knows what is at stake. He is now enrolled in the Health Partners plan.
I can honestly say if I had the support that I was getting from Health Partners years ago, I really don't think I would be in the predicament I'm in today.
A predicament that thousands can avoid if health plans manage to save money by first changing lives. Michelle Norris, ABC News, Minneapolis.
On the other hand, sometimes when health care plans try to save money, that's when the HMO horror stories get dragged out and told. About 6 million elderly and disabled Americans on Medicare are in managed care plans. Last year, about 400,000 people were let go, abandoned by their plans because the company said the elderly were too expensive. ABC's John Cochran tonight on what happens then.
What is this?
When we visited Otto and Lolo Heidlinger 4 months ago, they had just learned their HMO was dropping Medicare patients.
God forbid a severe situation arises, we wouldn't know where to take the money from.
When I was here the last time, Otto, you said, God forbid something should happen. Something happened.
Something happened. Lolo had a reoccurrence of her cancer, totally unexpected.
With the bad news came some good. Otto and Lolo were able to join a new HMO just before her breast cancer came back, although there was a drawback. Lolo needs intensive radiation, which will leave her exhausted. But her new plan insists she travel every day for 6 weeks from her home in Delaware to a hospital in Pennsylvania. The HMO has no deal with her local hospital.
Out of state, my doctors are not there. It's a hospital that is totally away from where we live.
On top of that, there is no guarantee that their new HMO won't drop them, just as their old one did. They were alarmed by a conversation with an HMO official.
He told me the other day, if we don't make money, we'll pull out. He said, if we are burdened with problems like yours, who knows what can happen?
A lot of elderly Americans are worried about their future coverage. Whatever problems they may have with HMOs, they count on them to help pay for prescription drugs, which are not covered by the traditional Medicare program.
John, this is the most important thing that the elderly people need.
The Heidlingers say they're willing to pay more to the government if Washington will then pay more to the HMOs so they don't go out of business.
So you'd say the solution is not to cuss the HMOs, but to see that they get more money.
That's the bottom line to the whole thing. Don't lose money on us. There is no need for that.
Maybe there is no need for that, but the Heidlingers have every reason to worry. HMOs warn that unless Washington increases premiums, they will have no choice but to drop Medicare and the 6 million elderly Americans, like the Heidlingers, who rely on them. John Cochran, ABC News, Wilmington, Delaware.
Tomorrow we'll take a closer look at what happens to patients when an HMO goes bankrupt. And they do.